Hey, well, thanks for joining, everyone. So this week's webinar, I think, will be a little bit shorter than last week's. Basically, based on a lot of you guys' feedback from last week, there was some interest in really just going through some of the very basic setup in actually deploying, from a software perspective, a very basic AirOS point-to-multipoint setup, and just to go through the basic steps to have something to refer to later. For instance, if you guys want something to direct installers or people unfamiliar with the platform to, or even just to have a bit of discussion with me and the rest of the guys on the webinar here as to some of the different setup options and things like that. So I'm Alex Marcham. I'm the airmax product manager, and I'll be going through the webinar with all of you today. So thanks for joining. For those of you who are more familiar with airmax, obviously the steps that I'm going to go through, being a basic setup webinar, are ones that I'm sure you've been through many times before. But I think a lot of the interesting stuff for you guys can come out with just interacting on the chat and asking questions and leaving comments about any features or best practices or anything like that as we go through. So I think probably what I'd like to do is probably follow this one up in a week or two with more of an advanced setup webinar. We can look at things like multicast. We can look at some of the more in-depth network setup parameters, all those kinds of things. But just based on feedback from 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of interest from the viewers and the Facebook groups and on our community forum, as well as people who emailed me individually on just some initial basic setup. So I thought that's what we could cover today. Let me know in the comments whether for the next webinar you prefer more advanced AirOS setup or something that I know has been requested, which would be more coverage on UNMS, which I know that's a very interesting topic. And if you guys would prefer that instead of more detailed AirOS setup, I can certainly cover that in the next webinar instead. We'll certainly get to UNMS very soon, but just let me know which order you prefer those in, and we can adapt as we go. So without further ado, I'll get through this initial setup, and feel free to leave any questions or comments or anything as we go through, and I will answer those as I get to them. So I wanted to say that the first port of call for me whenever I deploy any airmax link is going to be link.ubnt.com. This is our link prediction tool, which essentially lets you position in terms of coordinates and height your two or more ends of the radio link. Select the product family and the kind of product that you want to use. The tool will pretty much automatically recommend you the best client radio or set of P2P radios for that deployment. You can see here it's recommending me a pair of PowerBeam 5AC radios based on the range and everything that we're doing here. You can see I've configured the height of both ends. We can see the Fresnel zone chart on the left under link distance there. And I bring this up because I think, especially if you're a new WISP or a new deployment technician or anything like that, having an idea of the figures that you are really going to be able to expect from the link is invaluable. I think otherwise it's difficult to really be able to tell whether the link is performing as you want it to, because even if you deploy the link and it performs well, you don't know whether that's meeting what it should be capable of without the prediction. So this is always my first port of call. So definitely put this at the start of your list of deployment tasks. So for some reason I am unable to see the Q&A at the moment, so I'll have to get to that at the end, I'm afraid. The webinar software is not cooperating with me at the moment, but I can see the chat window. So if you could please post any comments in the chat, and if you have posted them in the Q&A already, if you could just repost those in the chat, then I'll be able to see those. So I apologize for that technical hiccup on my end. So it's it's definitely a good place to start in terms of your setup, predicting that. So let's assume you've already done that, and move on to the very initial setup. I see we've got one vote already for UNMS for the next webinar. So UNMS is winning so far. I will definitely put that at the top of the list. And you guys let me know if anything else comes to mind. But it looks like UNMS is the winner so far. So I will cover that either next week or the week after. If there's any specific stuff in UNMS that you guys want to know about, then let me know. Otherwise, I'll just do kind of a general coverage, maybe a two-part thing like we did for UCRM, where we cover kind of the basics and then some more advanced setup with a live demo and things like that. So you let me know. But just to whiz through this basic setup, because I think a lot of you guys are probably going to be familiar with a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here. So one thing that you'll know a lot of the time when you go to a lot of airmax AC units is they default to HTTPS. And if you don't already have the self-assigned certificate for that unit trusted in your OS's certificate store, you are going to get a warning somewhat like this. Now, the browsers, through very good reasons to try and stop you from going to, various insecure sites on the internet, are getting, ever more insistent on presenting these kinds of warnings. I know, Chrome gives you a very scary warning when you get to this point. This really is nothing to worry about with airmax AC. It's simply just because we use a self-signed certificate on each device, and that certificate by default is not included in your OS's certificate store. We've talked a little bit about whether we should, change the certificate included or get it signed or something like that. Those discussions are still ongoing, but just know for the time being that, when you set up a new unit, you're likely to get this warning. Seriously, just click through it. You can view the certificate if you wish to make sure it's genuine, but it's going to be. I mean, you can see the organization is Ubiquiti Networks. You can see the common name is the MAC address of the device. It's really just a case of the browser causing a little bit of a kerfuffle about nothing. So really just click through that and you will get to the initial setup screen here. So one thing I wanted to point out is I am going to be doing these just through the normal web UI. You can also use the UNMS smartphone app as we have at the bottom here. So that's for Android and iOS devices if you wish to use that. But I'm just going to go through the web UI at the moment. Really, the UNMS app is pretty streamlined, and the configuration steps are pretty much the same as we're going to go through here. So, certainly for any new users or installers, this run through will let you do it on pretty much any setup method you choose, whether you choose to do it on a desktop like I've done here or on the UNMS mobile app itself. Looks like we've got a few more votes for UNMS, so I will put that at the top of the list to cover in a webinar either next week or the week after. Thanks for the feedback on that one, guys. So in this initial setup, I mean, I'm using a US unit, so I basically have a choice between Puerto Rico, Canada, and the US. I'm going to choose the US. Please do select the country that you are operating in, because then it will give you the correct channels and power levels and everything for, obviously the location that you are operating in. You'll notice also you can select upload backup configuration at this point. That's kind of neat if you've had to reset a unit or if you are replacing a unit, something like that. You can upload a configuration file at this point, so you don't have to go through this initial setup, get to the menu, and then load it up. You can save some time by just uploading the backup configuration at this point. I'm using the latest current public release 8.5.11 on these units, and that's an option in that software release. So now I've selected United States, English language, and I've agreed to the EULA, and you see I can now upload the backup configuration if I want. But I'm going to continue, and I'm going to have to set up a non-default username and password. So I know the opinion varies a little bit on how effective things like password rules and non-default passwords and things like that really are. There's a lot of sort of back and forth on that, I think, but in my opinion, anything that just makes us remember to not use the default of, UBNT is a good thing. So you can see in this case, I haven't set up a terribly secure password. I've got a username of test and a strong password just of a few random characters there. You will notice at this point, if you try to enter a password that does not have the complexity or length requirements, you will get a password complexity hint there in the red text, and be made to enter one of a reasonable level of complexity before progressing on. So we've done that, we hit save. Now I wanted to put this screenshot in here because sometimes this confuses people a little bit. Like when you first start up, things are initializing. The air view scan there in the gray bar below the word link hasn't fully scanned the whole band yet, so it's a little bit gray. And just being an AP by itself, we don't have anyone connected yet. We haven't done any configuration. And sometimes people are a little bit like, hey, what does this mean? So really, again, this is nothing to be concerned about. If you give it a few seconds, this page really just quickly populates with a lot of information. But I wanted to include this step in here just so nobody is surprised when they first log into a unit. One thing to note is in the top right, we've got a little pop-up tooltip there. So all the airmax AC Gen 2 products come with a local range management Wi-Fi radio. So basically what you can do with that is connect wirelessly to these devices to configure them using either your browser or the UNMS mobile app. I was connected to this unit using the Ethernet port. And so I don't need the management radio to be enabled. It's enabled by default for 15 minutes after boot, or I can manually disable it with that helpful little tooltip up there. So now I've killed off that tooltip just to clear off the screen a little bit, and you can see that actually the frequency that my radio here is looking around on has actually changed. And why would that be if this is an AP, right? This is a Prism station that's designed to be an AP, so we kind of want it to be sat on one frequency. So the reason for that is by default, we boot up in station PTP mode. So in that case, we are treating this radio as the station end of a PTP link. It's going to be looking around for its kind of default partner PTP end, which it assumes has already been configured. That's fine. When we're first setting it up, that's a valid assumption, on the part of the software, because most of the radios that we set up are going to be clients, and it's better to have them automatically looking than all waiting to be manually configured. But in this case, we want this radio to operate as an access point. And I wanted to touch on one thing here. You'll notice a few modes here: access point, point-to-multipoint airmax AC, and access point, point-to-multipoint airmax mixed. Now, both of those are a little bit of a mouthful. I wanted to say that in time, we are going to end up with just access point, point-to-multipoint airmax mixed. We're going to hide that AC option, because the mixed mode supports both M and AC clients. So now with all the work that we've done recently on the mixed mode, there's not really any need to have the AC mode itself available. So we will be hiding that mode to make things a little bit simpler on setup for everybody. And we'll also be over time reducing a couple of these options just to make things as clear as possible that we can, make the best user experience for the operator, to make setting these things up as easy as possible. So you'll notice a few other things in this page. Interestingly, when I select the access point mode, I have a couple of tooltips pop up here. Basically, it's an interesting little note to bear in mind if you have a deployment looks like it's going to exceed one of these values. With this mode in flexible legacy Tdd framing, my maximum client count is 85, and with the 40 megahertz channel width that I've selected, the maximum distance between my devices is just under 14 miles. So that's fine. Those are all pretty standard things, but it's nice to just have that little bit of information to pop up. You can always disable those if you want as you go through. If you've seen it all a million times, then maybe you don't need them to pop up, but certainly can give you some interesting information. I see we just got another vote for UNMS, so Message received, guys. I will put UNMS at the top of the webinar calendar, and I'll put out the normal invite via the official Facebook group. Let me know if there's another way that you guys would like to hear about webinars as well. We usually just advertise them via the official Ubiquity ISP Facebook group, but we can also, look at other methods if you think that those would reach people a little bit better as well. So, couple of things to note on this page. Now, what I've done here, I've made a couple of changes here. So I've drastically reduced the output power. Excuse me. My apologies. I've massively reduced the output power because I was actually setting this link up at very close range. So as you'll see from my received signal level figures, when we get to the end of this link, I basically turned the output power right down to the minimum. But obviously, a lot of the time when you're an AP, particularly if you're starting out as an AP, a lot of people will just leave the output power at the maximum. I'll cover a little bit about why we have specific power control features and why those are most useful on the client side shortly. But just output power is that manual slider there. Within the regulatory limits that you have, you're able to adjust that freely. It doesn't require a reboot or anything like that. The antenna selection I've actually left as default. That's just the antenna that I have connected to this particular Prism station. In the case of the Prism station, that will give me, a drop down of the other support horn antennas, things like that. And on other radios, it will give you a similar drop down as well. Radios that have a, standard set of RPSMA connectors, you can also often specify the antenna gain there as well if you're using, a custom antenna of some kind. Max TX data rate, I typically leave as default unless I'm trying to cap the MCS rate or anything that I'm using. Typically, you can leave that as it is. The same for the data rate module. In wireless security, we have, as of a couple of releases back, made the default configuration WPA2 with this pre-shared key of 8 zeros. Basically, what that lets you do is have at least a basic level of wireless security out of the box without needing to configure anything. You'll notice that the option to turn off wireless encryption is no longer present, but we solved the default setup issue by loading each client by default and each AP by default with that WPA pre-shared key of 8 zeros instead. So I've also turned on this feature called wireless network protection, and you don't have to enable this feature, but basically there's no performance penalty for doing so. And what it does is it encrypts the control messages between the AP and the CPE. Now, it's important to encrypt these not because people are able to, listen to them in any way. Really, the information in them is basically meaningless to anyone listening to them, but it just prevents other networks nearby from being able to maliciously, if they were so to choose, attacking your AP and making it think that it has far more clients connected than it does. So if you're not deployed in an area where that's prevalent, you probably don't need to use this feature, but there's no performance penalty for doing so, so I like to just have it on by default. In Tdd Framing, I have also changed the duration setting here to flexible new. So I would recommend that as the default configuration unless you need to use synchronization. And I think in most cases, you'll know you need to use synchronization because it's already been, designed in, and most likely if you're a new installer, someone's already told you. Or if you are, kind of a budding network designer, network deployment guy, you can tell by areas where you have multiple APs co-located are places where you'll typically want to have synchronization, and areas where you don't, you'll want to use flexible new instead. So I'm pretending that my AP is basically, a greenfield deployment site. It's just I'm setting up one AP. It's my first AP, and so I'm going to use flexible new. You notice I get a little information bubble at the top here with this wireless mode and this Tdd Framing configuration. My maximum client count is 60. That's okay. Especially with flexible new, you're able to go right up to that limit. You won't see any of the performance degradation that you may see with older networks when you get up past a certain number of clients. That has been eliminated in MXAC with the flexible new mode. So don't worry about that. So some of these other features down the bottom, I was going to turn a couple more of these on as well. So another feature I like to typically have on by default, and unless I find a good reason not to, is receive signal enhancement here, or RESE as it's called for short. So basically, again, this is a feature that has no performance impact for enabling and can provide a significant level of resilience in the network to interference. So I like to have RESE on by default. It also helps with pretty much anything that will result in a varying receive signal. So things like noise and also things like short-term fades. Things like tree branches blowing in, temperature variation that can occur very quickly, or things impeding the Fresnel zone, like if you have a link that is crossing a highway, for example, and a very tall vehicle passes by, things like that. So I like to have it on by default. There are a couple of cases where if you have very poor performing clients, this feature won't help them, but for our default kind of setup here, I would recommend having it on. And also at the bottom here, you can see that we have, I've just clicked apply changes. You typically wait around 5 to 10 seconds for the changes to be submitted. Most changes don't require the AP to be rebooted, so typically just refresh the web page when it's done, as it did in this case. So one more configuration setting I did change, this is down here under advanced, is I configured automatic power control, and I've set my target signal down to -50. That is what I would recommend doing with your initial sector setup, as it prevents a lot of self-interference occurring later on if you were to leave everything transmitting at max power. Most of the other settings here under advanced, particularly for a simple setup, you don't really need to worry about. Sensitivity threshold, client isolation are off by default, and the other ones that are on by default are typically beneficial to have on, and I wouldn't really recommend changing those unless you really need to. Things like multicast enhancement, for example, which does a lot of IGMP pruning, is perfectly fine to leave on, even if you're not doing anything multicast specific. You're not really going to see any detriment to performance or functionality from leaving it on, and then by leaving it off, you could run into some unexpected issues. So I would just leave the rest of those advanced options as is. So one thing I also wanted to mention, as you can see in the basic wireless settings here, I've also statically configured my channel. So we do have automatic channel selection, I suppose. Some measure of automatic optimization of the channel in use. But I'm personally a fan of selecting the channel that I can see is the cleanest. And you can see here I've selected a center frequency of 5780. That was actually selected by looking at this AirView graph, which is now filled out. Now my radio's had a couple of minutes here to scan the spectrum. As you can see, much to my delight, it's actually quite clean. And so I've picked a very clean channel near the top of the band up here for 40 megahertz from 5760 to 5800. You can see that I've also got GPS lock. You can see I'm tracking 5 satellites. GPS signal strength is around 70%, and my Ethernet connection is in good shape, and my memory utilization and CPU utilization are pretty much fine. Some people will get a little bit stressed out about the memory and CPU utilization. I really wouldn't worry about it unless you see it constantly maxed out at 100%. In which case, that's something that may indicate that the radio is overtaxed, like perhaps has too many firewall rules configured, for example. It's transmitting a large amount of throughput, or there may be, in some cases, an issue that we can fix in the software. But those are really rare in comparison to how often people will look at the CPU utilization and memory utilization and just kind of think there's a problem just because they're at 50% or something like that. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time looking at the memory and CPU utilization there. You'll notice also under more details there, I've got UNMS, current status is disabled. I can cover that in a little bit more detail when we do the UNMS webinar next week or the week after. But you will see a lot of good details about UNMS in the UI when you have it enabled, both there and in the top right. that little button will glow green when your device is connected to UNMS. So you'll see also in this page, we've still got no throughput, no link length because we're just an AP, nothing's connected to us at the moment. So we're going to need a CPE to really, fill this page out and configure the other end of the link. Question from Craig here. He says, how do you keep customers from being able to see all the other clients on the network? Is there a way so if a client puts in a packet sniffer, all they see is their own packets, not other customer packets on that AP? So if we're talking about, say, I've got an AP and I've got 2 customers, each one of them is, in their own house connected to their own CPE. So they are not going to see by default traffic which is not intended for their client. Okay, so they can't just, we don't just broadcast all of the data from the AP to all the clients. Okay, each client gets only its own data. So even if he's sat there with a packet sniffer, he's not going to get, someone else's web page session just because they're attached to the same AP. So moving on, just a quick spin through some of these settings here and which ones you really need to care about in most cases, which ones you don't. This is a really simple setup that I've got on here. I've already got the basic, default IP address, this class C, /24 setup here. The gateway IP, my local PC here is functioning as the gateway IP router. Now, 1 or 2 of these options are pretty interesting even for basic deployment. I mean, we've got IPv6 turned on. I recommend leaving it on by default unless you have a specific reason to disable it. By and large, you may be surprised as a network operator by how much IPv6 traffic is already going around because a lot of devices have it on by default, and often they are talking to each other already because IPv6, as we covered in a previous webinar, has a lot of this stateless auto address configuration and auto conversant or protocol mechanisms that really can actually be pretty surprising. Like I've talked to a lot of network operators and they've actually been shocked sometimes about how much IPv6 traffic is already floating around on their network. So unless you've got a specific reason to turn it off, I would just leave it on. STP, spanning tree protocol, familiar to any of you guys from an enterprise switching environment. It's off by default unless you are doing, redundant paths and things like that. I would leave it that way. Typically, if you have switches and things connected, they're going to be passing their own STP BPDUs through the link anyway. Management VLAN, I think if you need to use a management VLAN, you need to use it before you get here. So if you do need to use it, that's the place to configure the management VLAN access to the management agent of the radio. But just for a very basic setup, we don't need to delve too much into any of these. If we change the configuration mode to advanced, you can see we get a lot more configuration options here. We get much more information about individual interfaces. Excuse me. We get a list of the advertised link modes for the Ethernet port, for example, the MTU for all the interfaces, any IP aliases that are configured, the flow control list, all that kind of stuff. We don't need to mess around with any of that right now, but just so if you click through it, it's nothing to really be worried about. If we had any VLANs configured, if we had any bridges configured, things like that, you would see a lot more information in here. The same for static routes. And you can see at the bottom of the page here, we have some firewall capability for both IPv4 and IPv6, and also some traffic shaping capability as well. So I can go through those maybe in a webinar after the UNMS one, if you guys are interested in some of the more advanced features that we have here in AirOS 8. So if I change to router mode, as you'd expect, we get a few more configuration options. Some are different. We have ACL configuration, we have DMZ configuration, all that kind of stuff that you'd expect from a device operating as a router, really. In this case, I really want to focus on that simple bridge deployment use case. So I'll carry on in that vein, and I will leave the router setup for another time. You can see there is, port forwarding, multicast routing, all those kinds of things that you would expect. Now, under services, one thing to know is I would say if you are deploying an airmax link, the same as any other network device, just look at what services you really need running. I think we have a sensible list of services enabled by default, which is basically HTTPS and SSH. For instance, if you don't need Telnet, don't enable telnet, right? It's simple case of reducing your attack surface, the same as I would recommend on any network device. There's no point in having services running that you're not using. So just bear that in mind. The system log will log automatically to this button in the bottom left. I will go into that a little bit shortly, but you can also send those logs automatically to a remote server via syslog if you wish. Device discovery with the Ubiquity Discovery Protocol is on, and CDP is currently off. One thing to note is here is actually where you configure UNMS. Again, I'll cover this in more detail in the actual UNMS webinar, but this is where you enter your UNMS key. And do note that to use UNMS, you're going to have NTP synchronized in the radio software as well. So under system, we have a few more configuration options and just general functionality here. So we're currently using the latest firmware, 8.5.11, so we don't need to check for firmware updates. You can see the device name, the device model. We can configure the device name if we wish. We can give it a special name for like a site location or anything like that. External reset is whether or not the radio will be able to reset by the power adapter. AirView is on. Again, I'd recommend leaving AirView on because that gives us that real-time view of the spectrum. Auto-sending crash reports, hopefully you're not encountering too many of those, but if you do experience a crash, you'll have the option to send us a crash report. If you do experience a crash, number one, my apologies. Two, please do send us those crash reports because they help us to isolate and fix any issues that you may have. Management radio on startup, you can see that's now been disabled by me clicking one of those earlier pop-ups, and I can have that radio enabled for 15 minutes if I want to. Date and time, you see this should really be synchronized to an NTP server, especially if you're going to use UNMS. That is very helpful for your network logging because it makes sure everything is reporting the same exact times. You can correlate logs between different devices, and I can also change my user account as well. Device maintenance section is pretty straightforward, I think. Software reboot option, reset to factory defaults, save a backup configuration file, so you could load that file both in this menu or in the start menu, as we kind of passed by earlier. And you can also download a support info file. So if you ever work with our support team on Facebook or anywhere else like that, those are very useful because what they let us do is be able to see the state of a lot of the internal services and functions going on in the radio. So if there's an issue that you're having or something doesn't quite look right and we ask for a support file, that download support info button is the place to get them. So moving on to the client, basically I'm setting up an ISO station 5AC here. I'm going to whiz through some of these because some of this is very common between the two ends of the link. Basically with the same setup, make sure you're using the same country and everything like that, so that you have access to the same channels and the same power. Yeah, I could have uploaded a backup configuration here. I don't have one for this device, so I'm going to click through. I'm going to log in. I've set up this password. You can see at the bottom of the page here, I also have links to a lot of tools that we have. So UNMS that we've talked about a little bit, UCRM, which is a billing and sort of operations accounting tool, Link, which is the link prediction tool that we talked about at the start, and Wi-Fi Man, which is kind of a neat little app that we recently released, which allows you to monitor and sort of scan and troubleshoot Wi-Fi connectivity and sort of local networks in that sense as well. So take a look at all of those. They're all pretty neat and they're all free for you to use. So with this one, as this is our client device, what we're going to do is we're going to set this up as station point to multipoint. Now you'll notice there's no corresponding station point to multipoint mode for each one of those individual access point modes. That's fine. It doesn't really matter as long as you have station point to multipoint. Note, not station point to point, but station point to multipoint set will be able to connect to RAP regardless of whether it's using MXAC or MX mixed modes. So that's fine. We want to select that. Now, when we get to the SSID, you notice I was actually using a non-default SSID. So by default, our client radio here out of the box won't automatically connect because we're not using this default, UBNT SSID. I would always recommend setting a non-default SSID, just one for your own network identification purposes, and two, to make things clearer and to prevent any confusion with reusing the default SSID everywhere. You wouldn't just keep reusing the default Wi-Fi SSID on home routers, I don't think. So good habit to do the same with your airmax links as well, whether they're point-to-point or point-to-multipoint. So if I do select, I click that select button, you'll see that my radio in the deployment station that I have it set up here can see quite a lot of networks, but the most interesting one is this one, test SSID, and you'll notice that it has a lot more information than the other ones in that it has a device name and it has a radio mode of airmax AC. So these non-airmax AC ones are just standard Wi-Fi access points. We can interoperate with those as a airmax AC device because we're designed to operate specifically for long ranges outdoors. We don't support that standard Wi-Fi connectivity because that's designed for fairly low contention indoor use, which is not the kind of environment that we encounter outdoors. So we want to select this one with the little circle on the left there. We want to pick him. And when we do, we are able to basically see that it's been selected as the SSID. I have the option to lock to the AP MAC. I'm not going to select that. I would suggest in most cases you also don't lock to the AP MAC because we have issues if people move an AP around, or maybe they take one down, or they want to shift people over to a different AP. Sometimes that can cause issues because they've configured 20 clients to lock to that specific AP MAC, and they either have to go and reconfigure them, or they have to put the other AP back up and then switch them over, and it's just unnecessary in most cases. So I'd recommend leaving lock to AP MAC off. I've also adjusted the output power down because these devices are very, very physically close to each other in my test setup here. So I've cranked that down to the minimum of -4. Again, we've got automatic power control on at the bottom here, and with wireless security, I'm just using that default WPA2 personal PSK pre-shared key of 8 zeros. I would, of course, recommend setting a non-default WPA2 pre-shared key. I would recommend setting that as a unique value for each of your SSIDs, but for this case, I'm just going to use the default to get us set up here. By the way, clicking hide, just in case anyone is unaware, does not change the way the encryption is performed or any information that anyone would or would not be able to see from the outside. It really just controls whether the digits of the passcode are shown in clear text on the UI. So just bear that in mind. But definitely recommend using non-default and strong username and password combinations, strong WPA2 pre-shared keys for each link, and setting your SSIDs to be values that are unique and meaningful to you in some way to help you in troubleshooting and selecting the right AP. So just clicking through here, really these are the same options for the client as they are for the AP in most regards. If you're using UNMS, you would set up both ends through this services menu with the UNMS key. In terms of system, you can see we have the latest firmware again on this device. A lot of these configuration options are the same. Again, you can configure the device name. I would recommend configuring those device names, similar to how I just mentioned configuring the SSID. It's not going to give you any additional security or anything like that, but just make them a value that is meaningful to you in some way, whether that's an address or a customer name or something that correlates to something in your own sort of management system, whether that's in Excel or UCRM or on a bunch of post-it notes on your monitor, however you want to do it. I would recommend UCRM, but some of us are still in the post-it stage, I know. So definitely configure those to be something that's meaningful to you rather than leaving them on the default, but it's not really a security feature or anything like that. You'll notice one difference in that the ISO station, as it doesn't have a GPS receiver, unlike the Prism station, does have this location setting. I would recommend filling that out, even just with data from Google Maps or wherever you are at the time, because the nice thing about that is you are then able to see the Fresnel zone view on the UI, which is a nice place to see it, because if you're troubleshooting a link, you can see what the kind of link.com prediction for it would be just already there in the UI. So definitely put that location into all of your devices that have GPS receivers, which would be your Prism Station and your Rocket Prism 5AC and 2AC will do it automatically. Your other ones, you'll just need to just put this in manually. It doesn't take very long at all. It's not essential, but I would definitely recommend it for our best ease of use features. It doesn't change your link performance or anything like that, but it can certainly help you with troubleshooting and just making sure your links are performing as you want them to. So I clicked on the little top right UNMS button, which then takes me to this page. I'll cover UNMS again in more detail, but just know that there is a lot of UNMS integration being built into the UI as we go along to make it easy to see what's happening. And UNMS itself has a lot of interesting graphs and stats, which I'll cover in the next webinar in more detail. But as far as this link goes, we are pretty much up and running. Now, I'll talk through a few things here. Some of them are a little bit unexpected, some of them are expected. But basically, one thing to bear in mind is on the left-hand side of this page, we're looking at the stats from the local end. Now, in this case, I'm connected via the Ethernet port to that ISO station. So typically as an ISP, you're probably going to be connected to the AP. So you'll probably see this flipped. But in the case where we're still setting up the client, we're going to see it from the client's perspective, which is what we have here. So you notice on the left, we have local end, we have the device name, which I haven't changed, and the product type, which is ISO station 5AC. We've got its MAC address below that, and we have TX power. You notice that -4 dBm auto limits reached is set because that is as low as the AP can tell the client to go, as we have automatic transmit power control on. Now, we've set it to say, hey, just go to -50 for your target power. So you'll notice because these devices are so close to each other, they're actually screaming at each other at around -20, -22. So definitely don't run any links that are this powerful against each other. These devices are very close by in my test setup here, but it's good to see that automatic transmit power is working there. You can see our throughput capacity is listed as 342 and 345 respectively. This is the way that capacity is reported in flexible mode. Basically, our actual bidirectional link capacity, if we put as much traffic through these devices as we could right now, would probably be around 340 megabits per second. The reason why capacity is shown like this is because as flexible mode could allocate, almost all of the link to transmitting or all of the link to receiving, it is capable at any given point in time of transmitting 340 megabits in either direction, but not both at the same time, if that makes sense. With fixed frame mode, we're able to statically allocate that uplink, downlink, transmission ratio, and the capacity reporting is more conservative in that regard. But just bear that in mind. The distance here, these radios are a little bit closer together than that, but that is just a timing measurement made by the radios, and it helps them optimize the link for the best performance. So don't worry about that. You notice the SSID is also mentioned above that. The airtime is also mentioned below that. This link is idle at this point, so that is not really filled. And on the remote end, we've got data about the AP. Now, you'll notice the small blue box with the arrow. You can click that to open a web page link to the remote end if you want to manage it that way as well. Basically, we can see air view data from both ends. You can see both ends see a little bit different information, which is kind of neat. You'll see a lot of difference, particularly when you have radios that are deployed much further apart than these are. Your AP may be seeing different things to your CPE, so it's always neat to see that in the UI itself, just like this. You can see our signals, as I mentioned before. These are incredibly, strong or hot signals. Definitely don't operate anything that is, this strong, but this is my current test setup, and that's the link I was able to get. So you'll notice that our RX data rates are at 8x for both ends. That's great. And you'll notice that our capacity is, 340 meg, but we've only put about 3 kilobits of data through the link at the moment, which is what you'd expect from a link that's just been set up and had no traffic run through it. So further down, we can see a little bit more detail about the different types of information that we can see. We can see, memory and CPU utilization for both ends. We can see the wireless configuration for both ends, all that kind of stuff. You'll notice that my ISO station on the left is connected via Ethernet to my PC. My Prism station on the right is not. That's expected just because I haven't got my PC or anything else connected to it at the moment. And of course, the Prism station has GPS section down there, which my ISO station does not. So if I click on the settings at the top right here, sorry, not settings, configuration menu, I suppose, or tools menu, I suppose is the word I'm looking for here, with the hammer and the wrench up there, you're able to go through a lot of interesting information. So we can provide a very high fidelity spectrum analyzer basically through the AirView functionality. We provide kind of a slightly summarized view of that on this dashboard page behind this little pop-up AirView window, but you can activate the AirView tool itself and see a lot of interesting data, like kind of a waterfall graph of the ambient noise level that will clock up over time. You can see we've only had this unit up for about 5 minutes. But it will clock up over time. So with a waterfall view, and the waveform view is a very nice kind of real time with some hysteresis in there as well to show you what's really happening in the spectrum. Most of these tools, to be honest, you don't need to use unless you're troubleshooting, particularly for a short range link, simple setup, but I'll just go through them because I think they provide you with a lot of good features here. The antenna alignment tool is very useful, also includes an audio indicator. Antenna alignment, as you can see here from my incredibly strong signals, is not that much of a problem for me. I do have a bit of a chain mismatch there with the little Delta 4 symbol at the remote end, but these particular radios are so close that that's the least of my concerns at the moment. But definitely when you're aligning a real link, pay attention to those delta values. You don't really want a chain mismatch of more than about 3 dBs. Ideally, you don't want any, but 1 or 2 is typically harmless. When you start seeing 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 dBs of delta between the chains, that's typically an indication that you're misaligned or you've got an obstruction at either end. So just pay attention to that when you're installing, or when you're later troubleshooting a link that's not performing as you want it to. Discovery, so we've only got the 2 devices here. If this was an AP, you'd be able to see a bunch of different clients connected to it. If we had more than 1 client, as you can see, but that gives us some good info, IP address, firmware version, product type, etc. In the site survey, this is kind of a neat way of representing all of the different networks that are around, compared to AirView, which is basically saying, here is the radio energy I've detected. What the site survey does is say, here are the individual networks and their SSIDs and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty useful. I would say for a lot of times, look at AirView first, because you may be encountering non-Wi-Fi based noise that you may need to get around. That is clearer in AirView than in the site survey, but it's always neat to see just the sheer amount of networks that are around in the area. Network ping, pretty much standard ping tool. As you can see here, I'm just pinging my PC from the connected ISO station here, nothing spectacular. The same with the traceroute tool. Always nice to be able to trace a possible network connectivity issue, through to even an end service like Google or something like that, from the actual customer device itself. So that is always handy. The speed test, you can see I've run a speed test here, and it's a bidirectional test. So I'm basically combining 150 meg plus 197 meg for my maximum throughputs here. My throughput test here is going to be a little bit invalid just purely because of how close these units are. But the speed test is going to usually give you a pretty accurate estimation of the throughput that you can expect from the link. Just bear in mind what I mentioned earlier about how the throughput capacity is reported in this wireless link mode. And finally, the constellation. So you don't need to really look at the constellation that much. It is a neat little tool in real time that shows basically how well the radio is able to decode the complex modulation schemes that it uses to transmit and receive high volumes of data. Typically, you will want to see the most boxes possible. and the most dots being confined to those specific boxes. If you're running a lower data rate, you will see less boxes and larger dots, and vice versa for a higher data rate. So just bear that in mind if you happen to try and troubleshoot a link using the constellation diagram. But typically, you can do very well with just looking at the RF environment on the homepage, the throughput capacity, chain deltas, and then moving a channel to a different one as indicated by AirView if there is a lot of noise on your channel. Just wanted to touch briefly on the system log at the bottom left here. I would say, to be honest, don't spend a lot of time looking in the system log. If you are having, an issue with the unit or something like that, usually I'd recommend just, either asking a question with our support team or checking on the forum or something like that. If we need to get some info from the log, we'll typically ask for a system log or support file. As we touched earlier, you can generate those in the system menu, but I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time scrolling through the system log, to be honest. So really, in terms of link setup, we're now back on the Prism station, and you can see this is basically the same, flipped around. This is probably the way that the WISP will be looking at it most of the time, from the perspective of the AP out to the clients. So you can see again that the remote end has been limited with automatic transmit power down to -4. Which is good, even though my signals are obviously still much higher than my target of -50, just because these units are deployed very close together. So one thing I wanted to briefly touch on, and I can do a little bit more of a deep dive into this feature specifically, is I talked about being able to select channels and things like that. We have a tool here, which is actually on the left, and I believe this will only function when you have an AP with the client connected, just so you're aware. But the AirMagic tool is pretty neat in terms of being able to get a little bit more info than what AirView gives you on what the Spectrum's doing. So first, you'll see that these channels listed in pink are DFS channels. Now, we can still use those channels, at least in my region, but we are then required to shift off of those if a radar is detected on those channels. So typically, I'd recommend deploying outside of DFS channels if you can get away with it. If you can't, then many successful networks do deploy in DFS channels, but just be aware of possible radar detections. One nice thing that AirMagic gives you here is this list of expected spectral efficiency. Here we're listing 6.2 megabits per megahertz, which is a pretty good value, and we could see that shift down the band. If there were more heavily interfered channels, we could see that they would be much worse in terms of spectral efficiency. So this feature is trying to give you an at a glance real throughput number for what you could expect if you operated on that channel. So just another tool for initial setup, but typically if you can pick a clean channel with AirView, then you probably don't need to go to AirMagic unless you're trying to troubleshoot a link issue later on. So that's really what I wanted to cover in terms of initial setup here for AirOS 8. Hopefully that covered what a lot of you guys wanted to know from the last webinar. I know there's a lot of interest in a kind of a basic setup webinar, and I hope this covered that. I see through a lot of feedback that we've got in the chat from this webinar. There's good interest in an advanced AirOS features webinar and certainly in a UNMS webinar. So I will take both of those into account. I'll probably cover UNMS in the next webinar. I'll see how much there is to cover. Maybe we do a two-part like we did for UCRM, an intro and a deep dive. And then for the advanced AirOS features, we can go through those a little bit later on, like multicast, firewall, IPv6, DHCP option 82, all that kind of stuff. So if there's any questions left from any of you guys, please fire away. I'll give it a couple of minutes here. And thank you all for spending some of your Tuesday morning with me on this webinar. I appreciate it and hope it was useful for all of you. I'll put the recording up on YouTube shortly, and that will be up there with all of our existing webinars. Definitely take a look at all of those on the Ubiquity Networks YouTube channel. There are a ton of our existing webinars. I think there's probably like 10 or 15 of them up on there. So definitely take a look through there for all of the past ones. A lot of good information there. Craig says best practices on securing our new network, firewalls and VLANs. So this is a pretty deep topic, depending on how deep you want to go with it. I would say when you're done with this webinar, take a look on our YouTube page. There's a network security webinar to take a look at that has some best practices that I always like to recommend. We've also done a few blogs on general AirOS network best practices. The main thing to bear in mind is it's not really any different to securing any other network, to be honest with you. You know, all network devices, I'm a fan of a separate VLAN for management traffic. Often use a separate VLAN for different customers just to provide layer 2 isolation. You can also definitely benefit from having a perimeter firewall. I would definitely recommend that. Yes, you can do firewall functionality on these individual APs and CPEs, but I'm personally a fan of having, you know, a dedicated router, you know, and firewall device like, you know, an airmax box, for example, between my network and, you know, the outside world, if you will. So I would definitely recommend taking those basic steps. I think that webinar should cover quite a lot of general security best practices. And you know, if there's any other specific you know, comments or you know, discussions that you want to have on network security best practices, I will put my email address here, and we can always, you know, carry that on, and maybe talk about that on a subsequent webinar as well. So I'll just put that in the excuse me, send that to all the panelists instead of every one of you. Let me just post that again. But hopefully that was somewhat useful. I definitely recommend VLANs for your own management traffic. Definitely recommend a perimeter firewall between your network and the outside world, and typically recommend a rooted network setup, both for scalability and some security advantages as well. Any update on new product release dates? We have some interesting stuff coming. I think you guys have probably seen some of the stuff on the early access store, the Monster Dish, which I think was 37 dBi, something ridiculous like that. It's huge. Very, very, very high gain, 5 gigahertz segmented dish. It's very cool. The LAP GPS, we have got that out of early access. That is on its way to distributors. That is a integrated 90-degree light beam AP with integrated GPS. The Lightbeam LR, which is a 27 dBi Lightbeam subscriber, is in the same bucket as that one. And the new products that you guys haven't seen just yet, we are looking to hit the early access store with very soon. So as soon as I can talk about those, I will, and we'll do a deep dive webinar on those for you guys. So to clarify, the Prism Station 5AC cannot connect to the UAP AC Pro. That is correct. So the airmax AC products do not support standard Wi-Fi because airmax is designed for long-range outdoor use. And there's a very good reason you don't use standard Wi-Fi for long-range outdoor purposes, and it's typically because of two things. One, what is known as the hidden node issue, and two, because of its contention-based access mechanism. So the problem with Wi-Fi is if somebody is transmitting, a client that wants to transmit will wait and back off until that client is done. So that works fine for a network, you know, an AP inside a home, inside an office building, for example, as long as you don't get too many clients on the AP. But outdoors, there are a lot of different sources of interference, different sources of noise. And if our outdoor network that's spanning, you know, 10 miles were to stop and listen for every source of interference, it basically would never work. So we have the airmax protocol, which essentially replaces all of the you know, 11AC or standard Wi-Fi functionality, and we just basically strip out that standard functionality and put airmax over that. So we're able to make very low-cost products using those Wi-Fi chipsets, but we don't support standard Wi-Fi connectivity. So if you need to do that, definitely look more towards Unify. If that's all the questions that everybody has, oh, no, my man Craig here. Do you happen to have any videos on running all of our traffic through a VPN? My provider is throttling certain types of traffic. We don't have one on that at the moment, but I think we might be able to sort something out, or at least post something to the community to get some discussion going. Do you want to send me an email with what the problem is, and we can figure that out. We can have some public discussion about it and work that one out for you. Anybody else before I close up shop here? I want to thank all you guys again for spending time to come to the webinar here. I hope it was useful for you. I know there's a lot of interest in new products, new features, and everything like that. And again, as soon as I could talk about them, I absolutely will. I would say that the next 3 webinars that look to be coming up are, UNMS seems to be the clear winner in terms of interest from you guys. Duly noted. Seems to be some good interest in advanced AirOS configuration, and also some interest in the AirFiber 5X HD with a lot of the features that we've recently added to that one as well. We've recently added 4096 QAM modulation, split frequency support, and a lot of other stuff as well. So I will balance all of those together. In the next week or 2 weeks, you'll see, the next webinar will be done, and we can move through those subjects pretty quick. So thank you, everybody, and I'll make sure this is up on YouTube very soon, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next webinar, either next week or the week after. Thank you very much.